All right, welcome back. Today we'll be picking up from where we left off. So this is the 1776 to 1783 section of your study guide, basically covering the American Revolution. In the previous videos, we've gotten to the reasons for the revolution, and we have sort of looked at some of the early battles. And now, having gotten to July of 1776, we're going to backtrack a little into 1775 and begin the actual war itself. All right, so let's get some screen sharing going. Here we go. All right. There we go. That down here, and let's start with basic strategies. This first thing we're going to talk about is the war in the northern portion of the colonies, about 1775, 1778. There are some central colonies here, also your New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, but we're going to spend a bit of time up in the north. And then after 1778, things will slide over to the south, and we'll see why that happens. For the British, the basic strategy here is to end it quickly, right? It is very expensive to fight a war across the Atlantic Ocean. So the hope here is to smash the American army, one or two battles, and destroy Congress. Okay? Again, because this is going to cost a lot of money, and so they want to get this over with quickly. For the Americans, or for, I should say, the Continental Army, small battles, defensive. It is always easier to defend territory than to conquer territory. Ambushes, hit and runs, or hit and fades, those type of things. Okay? So the Americans are going to avoid large battles as much as possible. And the reason for this is the Americans have a small, untrained army. Which is lacking particularly munitions like artillery. It's also lacking, as I pointed out here, experience and training as well. So it's going to play to its strengths: small hit and runs, hit and fades, ambushes, and so on. It really won't be until about 1777 that the Americans are able to put up the sort of large scale battles that the British have been wanting to fight. So after 1778, things will begin to change, and as we start seeing more large battles through the closing years of the war, we're going to start out talking about Canada, because Canada was considered to be the 14th colony, and the Americans sought to liberate Canada. And so they sent two armies up there. One went up here and seized Montreal, and then the other, the one we're going to look at, was this one that went the long route to Quebec. And that was led on the American sides by Benedict Arnold, who would later, of course, switch sides and commit treason. But Arnold was very important in the early war effort. And so he made the decision that he was going to leave. You can follow his route up into what is now Maine, move to a different map, and then follow the Kennebec until he reached the Chaudière, and then take that up here to Point Levi, right across Quebec. Easier said than done. Lots of problems. The canoes were not particularly well built. There were food shortages of all sorts. This part of Maine, nobody lived there. Not even Native Americans hung out in this part of Maine during the time of year that they're trying this. This is very late in the fall when, September of 1775. So there's not a lot of game. It's going to be very cold. And most people who live in this part of the country live very close to the coast. So once you get out here, you're really on your own. There's not going to be a lot of hunting to do, and you're not going to be able to get help from anybody either. Compounding all of these problems, and I may say even the root of all these problems, were Arnold's maps. The maps that Arnold had were extraordinarily wrong. For instance, according to the map, from here, Kennebec, to here, at Point Levi, was 180 miles. In reality, it is about 350 miles. So you can imagine if you're only taking enough food for maybe a 200-mile trip, and then you find out it's a 350-mile trip, the problems that's going to cause. This map issue was actually caused by the British. British policy was to circulate maps that were wrong to prevent enemies from invading their territory. Okay? Which is a pretty smart policy, right? You don't want to give someone an accurate map that they're going to use against you. So British policy was to circulate these maps knowing they were wrong. And of course, that's what Benedict Arnold fell for. So a bunch of men, he took about 1,100 men, about 300 of them turned back before ever even reaching a halfway point. Once they ran out of food, they began to eat anything they could get their hands on, including dogs, shoes, moss, grass, anything like that. They did eventually reach Point Levi with only about 600 men. Arnold then crossed out here in front of Quebec, what is called the Plains of Abraham, which is out here again in front of Quebec, and demanded that the city surrender, which must have been very funny to the British, considering that Arnold had no artillery to knock down the city walls. Eventually, Arnold's forces were reinforced. We had captured Montreal, and so Montgomery came up here to join Arnold. And they actually did attempt to invade the city of Quebec on the night of New Year's Eve, 1775. They did manage to break into Quebec. But they were not able to carry the surprise much further. The whole thing lasted about 6 hours, and in the end, a lot of his men were taken prisoner, and it was all over by 10 a.m. Arnold refused to retreat. He is tenacious, I will give him that. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, despite the cold temperatures, despite any hope of anything, he builds a camp and he waits for reinforcements. Unfortunately, the reinforcements that show up are reinforcements for the British. The British Army sending about 4,000 extra troops around May of 1776. And so, faced with these overwhelming odds, Arnold is now forced to retreat. If we go back to our map, Arnold retreats down the river this time, the St. Lawrence River, and then loses Montreal, retreats down into Lake Champlain. Now, at this point, Arnold receives new orders. As Arnold is retreating into the Lake Champlain region, that is not how you spell Lake Champlain. Let me see here. It's on this map. Plain, okay. Oop, it's not the button I wanted. As Arnold is retreating Lake Champlain, new orders to hold the British on the lake until late October. This was being done because at the same time Arnold was moving into the Lake Champlain district, George Washington was retreating out of New York. And for a while, Washington considered moving into the Hudson River Valley, this area. And so Benedict Arnold needs to keep the British out of the Hudson River Valley. So he receives orders to hold them at Lake Champlain up here. In order to do this, Arnold builds a navy and goes to war on the lake. And there is one fairly significant battle. This is called the Battle of Valcour Island. And you can see these are the American fleets up here, British fleets right in here. And unfortunately, the wind was not with the Americans that day. And so unfortunately, the Americans lost that battle. Yeah, if the wind isn't with you, it can be really, really hard to have a successful naval campaign. But the goal the delay is successful. Thanks to Arnold's battles, Arnold does hold the British at Lake Champlain until late October. If you're wondering why late October, basically at that point, the British need to stop fighting and start building a winter camp. And so, even though Arnold was defeated on the lake, he is successful in his goal, because remember, his goal was to hold the British on the lake, and he was successful at that. And again, what that means is that if George Washington wants to retreat into the Hudson River Valley, there's no British threat there that he has to worry about. Now, let's turn and look at what George Washington has been doing with regards to New York. Washington had not wanted to defend New York. He felt that New York had too many places where the British could land, but Washington had been ordered to defend New York City, and so he decided to do so. His mistake, his cardinal mistake, is to split his defenses across New York. Again, New York, there are lots of places where the British can land, like maybe they'll land on Staten Island, or maybe they'll land at Long Island, or maybe they'll cruise up here to New York proper. And so Washington had to sort of split his men up to try to cover all of the possibilities. All the possibilities that the British might land at. British will make landfall here in Long Island, coming around, finding a road here. A New Yorker betrayed his Americans and showed the British another way to get in here. And then it becomes a retreat through Brooklyn, up through what is now Manhattan, up through Harlem. Again, the British are now able to bring their ships in. So the Hudson River, the East River, the British are now moving their fleet into here. Washington continues to retreat past Fort Washington. And as you can see here, it does look like he's heading up into the Hudson River Valley, which is again why Benedict Arnold's actions are so important. Washington, though, will decide to not go into the Hudson River Valley. He will retreat back down through New York, through New Jersey, and then eventually at the end of the year, Washington will find himself in Pennsylvania. And it looks like the British plan to end the war quickly has succeeded. Washington had lost a huge chunk of his army was gone. Washington had 19,000 men in September when he was at New York. And now in December, he's down to about 5,000 men. And so it really looks like this is it. The war is going to be over. Of that 5,000, it will be reduced to 1,400 on Jan 1, 1777, because a lot of the men had only signed up to serve for 1776. Their enlistment was going to end. So things are looking really, really bad for Washington. And sometimes having the right enemy, I shouldn't say that. Sometimes the actions of your enemies are just as important as the actions of your allies. As the British settle into winter, W headquarters, they begin to anger the local population. The British are heading into winter headquarters right along here in New Jersey, and they begin to anger the population with what we would call looting, taking supplies from the locals, um, taking housing, literally kicking people out of their house so your troops can stay there, taking the furniture, taking the pigs and the chickens and the cows and all that stuff. Um, and there are rumors of rape being committed against American women. David Hackett Fisher, in his book Washington's Crossing, was able to prove at least two of those rumors of rape were legitimate. Like there were, and he proved this like in the 2000s. So that at least two American women had been raped. I would guess if he was able to prove it 200 years later, there's probably more than two. At least two have been proven. So those were probably many more. And so a lot of the local population went off, join Washington's army, right? You're going to treat us like criminals, then we will react like criminals. And so Washington's army does begin to sort of start to grow. But Washington needs a victory. Okay? It has been 4 long months of defeat, and he needs some sort of victory to try to keep his men, as many of them as possible, keep them around for another year. So Washington decides he is going to attack a spot called Trenton, which is in New Jersey. Let's go back here. Trenton is right here, just across the river. Washington is here in Newton, so he just has to get across the river. This is where you get the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. Obviously, Washington did not stand up on the boat. This is a lot of symbolism here. I'll explain some of the symbolism. There are 13 people in the boat, so that represents the 13 colonies. There is at least one woman here. There's at least one African American here. And so, again, very, very representative. They do have to get the horses across, and the Delaware had not frozen, so they did have to push the ice blocks away in order to prevent the boats from, pulling the Titanic. They're out there in the Delaware River. The next morning, which, by the way, is the day after Christmas, so Washington is crossing the Delaware on Jesus's birthday. You can see Washington comes down, and there was a snowstorm that came in, like a really bad one. In fact, 2 of George Washington's men died of hypothermia. So again, it was very, very cold. But that snowstorm also meant that the British did not bother to post sentries, according to the book. According to the book, the British were supposed to post sentries in today's measurements about every 300 to 400 yards. But because of, it's Christmas, the Americans have clearly been defeated. It's really cold out. They only posted a couple of guards just outside the main camp. So, complete and total surprise. Sullivan, Greene splitting down here. The attack begins at 8 o'clock in the morning. By the time it's over, an hour later, the Americans have won. They taking prisoners, taking supplies, and then moving back across the river. So it boosts morale. Some of the people who were about to be out of the army decide to enlist for another go. And then a week later, Washington, where is that map? Here it is. A week later, 8 days later, Washington attacks the British at Princeton and again scores another victory. So after months of defeat up here, Washington scores 2 back-to-back victories within 8 days. And so it does sort of breathe life back into an army that had been dying. Most of 1777 takes place in and around the Pennsylvania area. You have Brandywine Creek, Germantown. These are mainly British victories again. But the big story for 1778 is back up here in Saratoga. So that's what we're going to move to now, is Saratoga. Now, the last time we were in this area, the British, October 1776, had been stopped here at Lake Champlain, right? And now there's a British army controlling New York. So the plan here, scooch this off, the British plan was to send one army north through the Hudson River Valley. So an army would be coming out of New York, marching up the Hudson River. Okay? And then there would be another British army would march south through the Hudson River Valley. Okay? So we're going to have one army coming out of New York and going up the Hudson River Valley. Okay? And then we'll have this other army that we last saw tangle with Benedict Arnold come down south. And the idea here is to close off the Hudson River Valley. And if they can control the Hudson River Valley, that will cut England off from the war. Okay. If they close the Hudson River Valley right here, that will cut these colonies off from the war, because the Hudson River Valley is the gateway back and forth. So it's a good plan. It is a very, very good plan, but it never comes off. Okay. The army from New York that was supposed to march north doesn't get very far. Their pathway is sort of blocked by the Americans, so they really do not get very far. Up here, that army runs into a whole host of problems. The army moving south I'm just going to call this Burgoyne's army. Runs into a long series of hit and runs. And so like the Americans would attack the supply wagon at the back and then skedaddle off back into the woods. Or they might cut down a bunch of trees, the Americans, to block Burgoyne's army from being able to move forward. As this is being done, a large American army is building up at Saratoga. And in September, October 1777, these armies finally meet up. So this is the first day of battle. You can see the British have about 5,000 troops. The Americans have about 7,000, so they're pretty evenly matched. This is a large battle, the kind of battle the British have been wanting to fight. A nice big set piece sort of battle. All right. There are actually 2 weeks worth of engagement between the British and the Americans. This is the last day of battle. Gates now up to 12,000, so definitely outnumbering. And you can see here, again, Benedict Arnold sort of coming in and saving the clutch here, as it were. There's a point where American lines almost collapsed, and Benedict Arnold is able to sort of ride his horse in there and rally the men and sort of close that gap up in the line. So once again, Benedict Arnold being sort of the key, maybe not the main key to victory, but certainly an important part, kind of coming in at the right time at the right place. And then eventually British lines collapse and the British retreat. And so the Americans win this extraordinary campaign, and it has, they capture all the weapons and the men and stuff. But the Battle of Saratoga, the victory at Saratoga, leads directly to France finally joining with the Americans. For 2 years, we talked in a previous video about the Committee of Secret Correspondence. And so for 2 years, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and others have been trying to get the French to side with the Americans. And it will actually be the victory at Saratoga that will prove to the French that the Americans are capable of fighting large-scale set-piece battles like the one at Saratoga. So the Franco-American alliance will begin under the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, signed in 1778. This is basically a trade treaty between the U.S. and France, but it is loaded with a great deal of symbolism. If you recall the mercantile system from way back in Unit 1, British colonies were only supposed to trade with the British Empire. By signing this treaty, trade treaty, okay, France recognizes, oops, let me spell that correctly, recognizes that the colonies are independent and no longer part of the British Empire. Okay? So even though it's just a trade treaty, it is freighted with a great deal of symbolism that France is recognizing that we are a separate nation That's why even today, when a new nation is born, recognizing it through trade is still the way these sorts of things are done. So, a lot of symbolism in that treaty. It will transform the revolution. The French will send money, they will send medicine, they will send weapons, they will send troops. There will be thousands of French troops who come to America to fight the war. And of course, that magnificent French Navy that we talked about at the end of Unit 1 will now be at our disposal. It totally transforms the war because the Spanish and the Dutch will also go to war against Britain, not because these countries are fans of representative democracy and the idea that you can elect your leaders and you don't need kings. They're going to go to war against Britain to grab some more territory from Britain. This is basically a case of kick them when they're down, is what's going on here. Britain has been kind of strutting around like some sort of badass for the last 20, 30 years. And so Spain and the Netherlands figure it's time to get a few licks in against His Majesty George III. So it completely transforms this war from a local civil war in the British Empire into yet another world war. And the British will now have to start moving troops and naval forces to other parts of the globe in order to protect their empire. The war is also going to shift to the south. The British have essentially written off the central and northern colonies. If they can get, they still have New York. Maybe they can hold that. But for now, they've pretty much written off the New England colonies. And they're not so sure about Pennsylvania or New Jersey anymore. But they're going to shift a lot of their focus to trying to hold the southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, Carolinas. Georgia's not really in the thing very much. This is done on a premise, a theory. And the theory is that the southern colonies are more loyal. We haven't talked about loyalists. Loyalists are people who want to remain in the British Empire. They side with Britain in this war. And it's estimated that about 1/3 of Americans were, in fact, loyalists who did not want to break from the empire. And in fact, about 10,000 Americans will actually leave and settle in other parts of the British Empire after the war is over. So Southern colonies are more loyal. It should be easier to hold those colonies. And that's the theory. What are your proofs? Okay. Proofs are as follows. One, testimony from Southern loyalists, okay, who traveled to Britain to testify about the loyalty. And second, prisoner of war lists. If you as an American were captured, taken prisoner by the British, you had to provide, your name, but you also had to tell them where you were from. And if you look at those prisoner of war lists, they're pretty heavy on the New England and central colonies, New York, New Jersey, And then, of course, Pennsylvania, and of course, New England, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, those places. And that's true. Those prisoner of war lists lean pretty heavy on those colonies. It is a fact that Southerners did not participate in the war to the same extent as the central and northern colonies. Okay. But is that because they're more loyal? Not because they're more loyal. Southerners had a completely different reason for not participating in the war to the same extent as the New England and Central colonies. And that is fear of a slave rebellion. We are only 40 years away from the Stono Rebellion, which we talked about in Unit 1, that uprising in South Carolina. And so that is, 40 years ago, not really a long time ago. So there is this fear of slave rebellion. If we send all of our young men off to fight in the war, who will protect us from a slave rebellion? So it is not that the Southern colonies are more loyal, it's just they have more the fear from slave rebellions. And so the British are going into the South under a completely false theory that the Southern colonies are more loyal. Now, there are a lot of successes. Charleston, Camden, there's some victories for the Americans, victories for the British, and they go back and forth. Eventually, the British, realizing they need men and supplies, they need more men and supplies. Cornwallis, let me spell that out for you there. British commander, Cornwallis. You can see here he moved initially to Wilmington because he needed supplies, and then moves up here to Virginia and eventually to Yorktown. And that is a terrible mistake to move to Yorktown, because Yorktown is surrounded by water. It is right there along the Chesapeake Bay. The idea is that British warships would be able to come in and resupply the French. What happened, though, resupply the British, is the French Navy came up here and defeated the British Navy right here off the coast of Virginia. You can see Yorktown is right here. So again, the British have been expecting to be resupplied by Graves, and the French stopped that. And then the French closed off any hope of rescue. And then at that point, Washington simply started moving his men into the Yorktown area and started moving forward. There are French and, as you can see, French artillery camp, Rochambeau, the French commander. So there are French troops. This gold color up here is all the French troops. Here are the Americans down here. And then at that point, you just start moving forward and you start getting your artillery. You can see battery is artillery. So here's the American artillery, French artillery, and then you can see them moving forward. And eventually, in October of 1781, October 19th, you can see the date up here, Cornwallis surrenders. And that, to everyone's surprise, is the end of the war. the end of what we would today call major combat operations. Much to everyone's surprise, New York City was still held by the British. Washington had already begun planning how he was going to have to march up to New York City and drive the British out of that. But the British, excuse me, the British finally decide, the British finally decide that they have had enough. The war has gotten extremely expensive. The British are also having to fight off the French and the Spanish in particular in other parts of the world. And so the British finally decide that enough is enough, and they open peace talks with the Americans. The peace treaty that is signed is the Paris Peace Treaty. (1783). So let's look at 5 parts. 1, acknowledges American independence. The United States is now a free country. Would have been kind of dumb to fight the war and forget to get that. 2, U.S. territory. The U.S. receives all territory east of the Mississippi River, except for Florida. So if we look at this last map, what are called the Great Lakes states up here, and then what is now Kentucky, Tennessee. One of these is Alabama. Wait, that's Georgia. One of these is this is Mississippi. This one. Okay, it took me a second. And then Alabama. So the future of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9 future states are carved out by the Paris Treaty, but we do not get Spanish Florida. We get everything east of the Mississippi except for Spanish Florida. 3, British can use the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is an international river at this point. The British need it to move in and out of Canada. Okay. So they're allowed to keep using that. Loyalists will be compensated. A lot of property that belonged to loyalists had been destroyed during the war. A lot of times, if you found out your neighbor was a loyalist, a mob of people would go over there and burn their house down or something like that. And so the British insisted that the loyalists be financially compensated for their losses. That also includes the loss of slaves. They must be financially compensated for. That one's going to take a while. That one's not going to be as immediate, and it's going to affect things down the line. And then finally, 5th, both sides will cooperate to collect pre-war debts. When the war had broken out, a lot of people who owed money on both sides of the Atlantic just stopped paying the bills. So now that the war is over, you need to pay your bills. So people who had maybe bought some furniture or some clothes from Britain had never paid for the stuff. British merchants who had gotten maybe some tobacco just before the war broke out had never bothered to pay for the tobacco. You need to pay for that stuff. Okay. Now, those last 2 are going to take a while. They're going to cause some problems for the new country. and we would look at, make sure I say this, we will look at those problems in our next video, which is going to be about the Articles of Confederation. And I will see you there, and good day.